Welcome to the Unscripted podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Nicastro. Today, we're going to be talking about how lean methodology is guiding service transformation at Diebold Nixdorf. I'm excited to be joined today by Brian Gallipeau, who is the Senior Vice President of Service for the Americas at Diebold Nixdorf. Brian, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. It's great to be with you, and thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. So before we get into the discussion, tell everyone a little bit more about yourself, your background, your role, anything you want to share about Diebold's business,
Sure.
and we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, when I think about myself, I always try to go back to my roots. And, I started out as an engineer at Kodak, doing research and design. And I think that really permeates everything that I do and how I approach things. So it's kind of an engineering approach, and lean kind of fits in with that as well. So,
Mhm.
after Kodak, I went to Xerox, but then I spent the majority of my time at Canon, about 20 years at Canon, actually. I'm running service in the printing and multifunction device area. And then I was recruited by DN to run the Americas region for service organization. So in total for DN, that represents about 8,000 people
Mhm.
in my organization. And if you look at DN as a whole, service represents about 50% of the people in the organization, and obviously contributes a huge amount to our overall revenue and profit. So, it's a super important part for DN. And I think as we talk further, you're going to see that, DN's really kind of in this transition of how do we move from a truly product only company to a real service oriented company.
Yeah, that's a journey a lot of folks are on and can certainly relate to. Yeah, for sure. So you mentioned that you were recruited into DN, and compared to some of the longevity of your former roles, it's been a relatively short time. But you mentioned that one of the things that drew you in is the company's willingness to change. So
Yep.
can you talk a little bit about, what that looks like at DN, what you've noticed, and also why you feel that's so important.
Yeah. So, if you think about DN really actually is a really old company. It's been around for quite a long time. But really, this company, as I mentioned before, is really transitioning from purely product to a real service focused company. And with that, we've recruited a lot of new people. And if you look at the management structure inside of DN, relatively new. So there's not that, in typical companies, that internal resistance to try something new, or the kind of silo approach of, don't come over here because this is not your area, it's my area, and kind of don't get involved in my business. There's really not a lot of that at the end, surprisingly, for how old the company is.
Hmm.
Really, when we look at problems and so forth, and we try to address issues, it's really the team coming together and looking at it, trying to be successful in solving the problem, not, hey, this is my area, not your area, and none of that kind of silo kind of approach that companies have
Hmm.
in the past. And if you really dig into that just a little bit, I can give you a good example of that. We had some issues with parts being sent out to technicians, and the packaging wasn't great, right? And what did we do? We brought down the engineering team, we brought down the packaging people, we brought in people from the repair center, and we looked at the packaging, and really the team worked together to say, what, this packaging is not, what the original parts are shipped in, and why do we choose this? And let's make a change, right? Not,
Hmm.
hey, don't touch it because that's my area, or things like that. It just really was
Yeah.
a great example of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. In companies that have a deep legacy, there's a lot of protectiveness, a lot of, and I think even more so when there's any change initiative, right? Because the
Hmm.
people start to, want to protect their role, their knowledge, and that, it's hard to work against. So, yeah, that's good.
The favorite saying is that's the way we've always done it. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, well, it's not the way we're going to do it in the future. So that's good.
Yeah. And when you're on a journey to evolve a business from being, really, really product centric to more service centric, um, you can easily just get lost in different versions of that's how we've always done it, and so yeah, it's quite a trap. And I'm sure that, it's a relief, to be within an organization that's kind of on the same page and aligned about, that need, but also what it's going to take to make that happen, and
Yep.
that communication across functions, looking at things as working as one team instead of, yeah, being protective in those ways. So very good. It's super important, I think, for today's businesses in general. I mean, change is just a constant.
Yep.
And if you, are trying to hold on to whatever's working today, let alone yesterday, it's just a recipe for failure. So, really important, but particularly when you're on the journey that Deanne is on to, move more into service centricity.
Yep.
So, you and I talked about how you're using a lean methodology, and we're going to go through some of the specifics of how you're doing that. But before we do, you said that you feel lean has a ton of potential in service, perhaps even more so than in manufacturing. So before we get into some of the details, can you talk a little bit about the opportunity you see?
Sure. Yeah. So, in a manufacturing environment, you think about that, it's really kind of a closed system, right? And you have complete control over what happens inside of that building when you're doing manufacturing. Whereas opposed to in service, there's, thousands of people out there in the field across multiple countries, and they're doing projects, and they're typically solving the same problems.
Hmm.
But if you give it to 500 different technicians, you may have, 499 different ways of approaching a problem, right? And so being able to have a standard work process for that many people distributed is a different scenario than just having a traditional, assembly line doing it one way, right? And that really gets into the parallelness of the ability to use lean, right? So, again, if you're in a manufacturing environment, it's one or two manufacturing lines, maybe five manufacturing lines. We have, potentially 500 people solving the exact same problem every single day, right?
Hmm.
Think about the power of being able to do that in a standard way, in the most efficient way, or even just a slightly more efficient way. It just, the amount of multiplication of the benefits is just enormous from that side.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, when we think about how DN is using lean to transform service, what does that look like at the strategic level?
Yeah. So, if you can look at the types of problems that we have, and, and most products, most hardware products and so forth, even software products, typically have, the top 5 or 10 problems that people solve on a day-to-day basis. If we can really just get a handle on those problems and get technicians to work in a standard way to solve those particular problems, 80% of the time, the benefits there are huge, right? So looking at that kind of in a more holistic way, right? You think about this in terms of a technician, and this is kind of the old way versus the new way approach, I would say. You look at it, and typically the way it's been done in the past is, you develop a standard work in a kind of a pristine environment in a lab with maybe an engineer or maybe a service trainer or something that's trying to figure out the best way to do something. But then it goes into the field, right? And think about an ATM, for example, right? An ATM in the middle of a room, and you're trying to do a repair process on that. Then you get into the field, and I'll take the example that we do in Mexico, right? The machines typically are through the wall. Half the machines inside of a vault, half the machines outside of a vault. It's a kind of a double door vestibule to get into the vault. So essentially, you have to wait 5 to 10 minutes to get through the second door.
Hmm.
And if you have to do a 5-step procedure, and steps 2 and 4 are in the front of the machine, and 1, 2, and 5, 1, 3, and 5 are inside the vault, just think about the difficulty of that from a technician standpoint. Now,
Hmm.
somebody who's developing a standard work in kind of the pristine environment would never see that, right?
Hmm.
So really, this is about having the technicians involved, helping us figure out what's really truly lean when we approach a problem versus, what does it look like, from a, pure engineering. And I could say that from being an engineer from the
Yeah,
pure engineering standpoint, this is the way you should do it, right?
right.
No, not necessarily, and what ends up happening there is you end up having, multiple different ways of approaching a problem, or even shortcuts. And maybe the shortcuts are not the best approach, and sometimes they cause more problems than they're worth, right? So
Hmm.
I think that's
Yeah.
kind of our methodology.
But in that example, it becomes
Mhm.
really clear how, I'm just thinking about, we're talking about change and resistance to change, right?
Mhm.
And this idea of, I think part of service transformation is certainly, in every initiative you're looking at, okay, well, we have a need to standardize our processes and adopt a standard approach so that, service is consistent everywhere. And in that example you just gave, it becomes really clear, um, how and why you have, you know, field technicians or field engineers that are rolling their eyes when they are introduced,
Sure.
here's your new process, do it this way. And you have the vault situation, where the steps don't make sense. If you don't have that perspective when you're, developing those processes, then it's really easy to see where, those frustration points come from. And then, you have that resistance to change, which is human nature, that just gets exacerbated because what you're suggesting is not really realistic in the real world. And, it causes that disconnect of them feeling like you don't even understand what we do. You're telling
Yep.
us prescriptively to do it this
Yep.
way, and you don't even, care enough to realize why this is not, not realistic. So, yeah, that's a really good example to think about. And so part of how what you're doing is different than just, generically standardizing processes is involving the front line in the creation of what the lean practice is. Is
Yep.
that,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah.
And it's the small wins, right? So when you bring in those technicians, and especially, and I will tell you that, most of the time when you're trying to introduce change, it's really the guys who have been, or the people who have been here for the longest time, right? That are the
Hmm.
ones that are the most resistant, right?
Hmm.
But if you can give them those small wins of, hey, you know what? I helped develop this particular procedure, and this is really the right way to do it, and that really permeates throughout the organization, and
Hmm.
that communication, that ground level communication between technician to technician, you can't even, it's impossible to measure how important that
Yeah.
is between the technicians, right? And that goes a long way to try to help, cultivate that change, and that kind of that idea that it's probably a better way to do it.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I had on a communication expert a while back, and one of the things that he spoke about that, you know, to your point, I think there's great awareness about the lift that can come from getting, even a handful of tenured or influential technicians, on side when you're in a change effort. But he talked specifically about, and I don't remember the metrics offhand, but leaders within an organization make up X percent of the workforce and can influence directly X percent, where these internal influencers
Yep.
make up, a smaller percentage of the workforce, but have the potential to impact far more. And it's exactly what you're saying, like that, it's the word of mouth, but it's the peer-to-peer respect. It's,
Yep.
all sorts of different things that make it really hard to measure how, important that really is. And the other thing that I was thinking about actually, when you were speaking in the beginning about the fact that, DN's leadership team is all not all, but a lot of them are new, and everyone's sort of in alignment about, this need and willingness to change. I had a thought to myself, like, I wonder how the workforce feels about that, right? So
Yep.
specifically to your point, some of the people that have been there a long time, and you can imagine this wave of new leaders coming in and you kind of
Yep.
thinking, "Oh, okay, what's next, right?" And to your point, showing them the respect of, wanting their knowledge and incorporating them into the process, not just as sort of a checkbox exercise, which I think is sometimes what happens, but to genuinely achieve that best outcome is a good way to, help overcome that. Okay. So were you going to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that is so true. And at the end of the day, right, it comes down to the fact that, you know, um, for the folks that have been here a long time, getting to, obviously 8,000 people, I'm not going to be able to meet 8,000 people in person and shake their hand and talk to them, for an hour about what's happening in their life and so forth. But, what we do is, on a weekly basis. We have a training center here in our new center in North Canton. And when the technicians come in for training, we pull 5 of them out of the class. The ones that are, we say are doing the best in the class. We kind of give them a little bit of award. They come and they have lunch with myself and or one of my other leaders in our organization, and we ask them straight up, what's bothering you? What's the
Hmm.
problem in the field? And really, then taking a step back and making sure that when they tell us something, we fix it, right? And
Hmm.
that's the most important thing is they tell you that there's a problem, and you actually go out and you actually do something about it. That
Hmm.
you can't overestimate the amount of impact that has in the field. It's like, hey, I had lunch with Brian the other day, and I told him that we had this issue in the field, and guess what? We have different screwdrivers now, or they're giving us all
Hmm.
different whatever whatever the problem is. And that goes a long way towards to building the relationship, and also making sure that some of the folks that have been here quite a long time understand that this is a new venue, a new organization.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's a really good point. It builds the relationship, but it also gives you the opportunity to uncover, what are those pain points,
Yep.
because it could be something you wouldn't think of because it seems small in the grand scheme of things. But if it's something that is important enough for them to bring up at a lunch, then, to your point, let's dig in and let's fix it, right? If it's, troublesome. And I think that's where so many leaders, don't get that exercise isn't just about giving them face time. It's about benefiting from their knowledge and experience. There's a lot to be learned that can really help take these transformation efforts in the right direction if you're listening to actually take action instead of listening to just say you listened, right?
Yep.
And that's it's a big difference. So
I
good.
think what most leaders miss, and to be fair, is that it's not the one thing. A lot of companies go through issues and they have layoffs or big things happen, right? And it's not that makes people upset or makes people leave the company. It's the 500 little things, right?
Hmm.
And we as leaders, sit back sometimes and say, well, that's not that big a deal. They got to press 3 buttons in order to do this, but do that every single day, five
Hmm.
times a day, and it just grates on you and grates on you, grates on you. And that's what, people are like, well, they're not listening to us at this point, right? Because we
Yeah.
keep telling them that's broken and they don't fix it, right? So,
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. It's a really good point. And I think there's not enough times that we can reinforce the importance of, listening to really listen and to take action instead of listening to just, give them the impression that leadership cares, right? That's
yep,
absolutely not
agree.
enough. If anything, it works against you, right? If you don't want to take action on what these people have to say, don't have lunch with them and ask them what's
Right,
bothering them because
exactly. Yeah,
if you do and then you do nothing, it just pisses them off,
yeah.
I mean, it causes bigger problems.
Or
So
at a minimum, tell them straight up that that's
you
I
can't do
understand
it.
their problem and we can't fix that. That's
Absolutely.
just
That's perfectly fine.
yeah,
It's also unrealistic that you can address every single thing or at least every single thing right now.
yep,
And I think that's a really good point, Brian, because I think that's part of the fear in doing that, what you're doing, spending that time and having those conversations, is that it's creating an expectation that everything will immediately be resolved.
yep,
That's not true and it doesn't have to be true, but you have to have that transparency of, hey, actually, that's not an issue we would be able to address, and here's why. Or, I hear you. I want you to know I hear you, but it's going to take some time to dig into this. Whatever the answer is
yep,
fine. It just can't be that they see it fall on deaf ears and nothing ever happens. And,
exactly.
yeah. So, really good point. All right. So, let's talk about some specific examples of lean in practice at DN. So the first one on our list is through ride-alongs.
Yep. Good. Yeah. So this is a great one because, you know, typically what happens in a service organization is, frontline managers are assigned to do ride-alongs, and it's kind of probably even one of their KPIs, right? I have to ride along with 3 technicians a month or whatever the number is, and at the end that's different, right? So if you look at what happens in ride-alongs, um, pretty much everyone who's in a management position does a ride-along with the technician. So, and it doesn't matter whether you're in procurement or whether you're in HR, or it doesn't matter what the role is. You need to be out there and actually feel what the technicians feel on a day-to-day basis, because again, this is what our business is. And if you don't understand, you can't make intelligent decisions about what we're doing, right? Think
Hmm.
about it from an HR position, right? And this is a complaint that a lot of organizations in the services area have is, I'm out there and essentially you have some sort of dispatching system, and then you also have some sort of HR system, and I have to record my time in the HR system. And oh, by the way, on the other side, where I am. So why do I have to record my
Hmm.
time, right? It's like, it gets back to one of those things. It's the 500 little things. But being an HR person and not seeing that in real action, you never see it, right? You're like,
Hmm.
oh yeah, well they just put their time in here, and they, we know that we're tracking them here. So, having everyone go out there and actually be part of the ride along and make sure they understand what happens on a day-to-day basis is super critical, especially if you're in this transition trying to go from product to actual service. And I would
Hmm.
say that goes all the way down to our CEO. In fact, Octavio, when I was on a ride along just a few months ago with some of the technicians, and gave us some very pointed feedback on what he thought. And believe me, technicians are not shy, right? So
Hmm.
they'll tell you exactly what they think, and what needs to be changed. And that's great, because that's all good
Yeah.
feedback for us.
Yeah. I love that. It reminds me actually, a couple years ago, I hosted an event in Paris, and we had Culligan, a couple leaders from Culligan's were speaking, and they said, they have service week at the business, and during that week, every function of the business, every level gets involved in the service process to really understand what it looks like and what the importance is. And I know we're talking specifically about lean and creating these processes and whatnot, but there's also just such a real benefit to that type of involvement and awareness outside of the service function in terms of, expanding the awareness of how important this work really is, and how, especially when you're trying to focus the business more in that direction. There's all too often, a company will say, yeah, we're trying to grow our service business, or we're trying to put more focus on service, but the people that are executing it don't feel important. They don't
Yep.
feel, that they're such a big part of the strategic direction of the business. And, you know, making it so that everyone in the business needs to understand what that role is and the impact it has is a great way to make that function feel that it's important enough to take time for everyone to do that, and to have all of those different folks involved. So I
Absolutely.
really like that. The next one is Kaizen events.
Yep. So we, again, kind of going back to the lean, more of the lean topic in general. We really seriously take Kaizen events as kind of a real um, important aspect of what we do on a day-to-day basis, right? So we're probably going to have 20-ish Kaizen events, and when I say Kaizen events, they're not um, kind of three or four people getting together and figuring out how to do something a little bit better. And what we're talking about here is bringing together 100 people from all different areas of the organization at all levels, and focus on a result. And we do those in basically week sprints. And it's not about, hey, let's go in, kind of diagnose and see what's going on, and then come out of the week with a list of to-do list, right?
Hmm.
That's not what it is. It's, let's have all the people in the room who have some sort of a stake in the ground on what they need to do to fix this problem, and let's actually fix it this week. And let's not
Hmm.
walk away with, hey, Sam has to do this and Susie has to do this, and it's like, no, let's actually, if we need to make a code change, if we need to implement something in IT, we'll have an IT person at the table. If there's something involving HR, we have an HR person at the table. If it involves fleet, from a fleet standpoint, we have a fleet person at the table. So really, those Kaizen events are really seminal for us, and making sure that when we're doing those, we're actually going to get the value out of it, right? So we're actually fixing problems, actual problems in the field, and that even goes down to technicians, having technicians at the table as well, right? As we talked
Hmm.
about before, our managers, to say, hey, this doesn't work for us in the field anymore, or technology changed, or the customers are expecting X and we're delivering Y, and we need to
Hmm.
change that. So I think
Yeah.
Kaizen events are super important for us from a lean perspective.
Yeah. No, I like that. And I think, it's I like the distinction you made about it isn't just sitting in a room for a week talking about how to solve the problem. It's actually taking action and getting that resolution, which also points back to how the teams cross-functionally are empowered to do that. It isn't working toward then a bunch of internal uh policies and okay, well, we have this solution now, it'll take us 6 months to implement it,
Right.
right, because of
Exactly.
X, Y, and Z. It's actually having the support across the company to say, okay, this is how we're going to do things, and we want to be able to make these improvements in real time.
Yep.
Okay, the next one is video training.
Sure. So, in our daily life, and every company is doing this, right? We're using a mixture of training, which is video training, but also in-person training. You talk to technicians and, you know, in one sentence, they'll tell you, I need to have hands-on, and the other sentence, it's, well, I can't spend that much time out of the field. So it's that balancing act that you always have to have. But for us, really, it's more about making sure that, because technicians, when they go to even an online class, or if they go even in person class, having them try to remember what they learned 3 months ago in a class that they took is is almost impossible, especially if you're a completely fully trained technician. You're working on multiple products, multiple different hardware platforms. It's just not really feasible to actually do that. So that's why, in our sense, and we're probably, at least in the top quartile as far as leading the pack on trying to get the data to the people when they need it, right?
Hmm.
So having that video help. So with our All Connect field support and our All Connect data engine, essentially having information so that we know what's happening on the machine, and we can give them the information very specifically about what we think is happening with that machine, and that includes video training on the spot, parts
Hmm.
list, repair instructions, and so forth that they can utilize immediately or even before the call, and really help them from that standpoint.
Good, good. Yeah. Um, that is a good example. And you also mentioned, the example earlier about the idea of dispatch knowing where everyone is, but people
Mhm.
still needing to, clock in and clock out or that sort of thing. These are really practical examples of where you can apply technology to be tremendously helpful if you are getting into the details enough to know what's needed and when and how, right? And
Yep.
that's what every organization should be doing. So, yeah,
Yeah, these
really
are
good.
solvable problems today, right? I mean,
Yeah,
these are not. That's not 1980, right? Where things were all separate and so forth. These are
yeah,
really, even with the advent of AI and the ability to do things quickly, it's really just a matter of how badly do you want to do it, right? And what's
right.
preventing it.
Exactly. Yeah. The next one is scorecards.
Yep. So we really have transitioned our organization to and this is going to sound a little bit funny, but when people typically do a project or even an action, right? It's always, hey, I think it's right now it's July. We'll have that done by August. We don't do that anymore here at the end. Basically, we say it's not July. It's not now July, and we're going to finish in August. It's like, what day in August are you going to finish that project, or what day are you going to finish it in July? So I think looking at it from a overall standpoint, we use bowlers a lot in our organization, and those bowlers basically tell us what's happening on a day-to-day basis. We manage those weekly to make sure that we understand where we're going to land for the month. So it gets back to that: manage the day, manage the week. The month really takes care of itself.
Hmm.
But really, kind of looking to the scorecard piece of it, and I wrote an article some time ago for one of the magazines, ASQ magazine, and if you get to the point in a cycle of mid-year review where you go into a review with a technician, and they're surprised by what their score is, or what their performance review is, you failed as a manager, right?
Hmm.
So having that scorecard and being able to show the technician, here's what you're doing, here's what your peers are doing, here's what the expectation is, and let them be able to look at that on an ongoing basis is invaluable, right? Because then
Hmm.
there's no surprise, right? They know, here's where you are, here's where you want to be, and here's what you need to do in order to get there, essentially. So I think that's kind of where we are from an organization standpoint, and it's really about managing every single day. What did you do today? How many calls did you take during this day?
Hmm.
How long did it take for you to do that call, right? And are you better or worse than your peers?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this, ties into, we talked about how when we think about incorporating lean and, managing all of the change that's underway, you said people don't come to work not wanting to do a good job. And I think
Yep.
this is a really good example of, giving them the visibility, the transparency, the communication that is needed to understand, what is expected and, how they're performing and that sort of thing. Are there any other ways you can share where, this application of lean, helps you to manage change and to empower teams to, achieve what it is you want them to achieve?
Yeah, again, really, it's about those success stories, right? So when you have somebody who goes out there in the field and is able to do something, and it's just like it's just like it's funny because every time I approach a problem at home, right, my typical thing is to dig into it first, and then my kids come to me and they say, "Well, did you watch the video on YouTube?" And I'm like, "Well, probably not a video on my specific washing machine or whatever it is that I'm working on at that particular time." But guess what? There is one, right?
Hmm.
And when you look at it and you're like, that was really not smart of me not to go to YouTube first and look at the video on how to fix that. But it's a success, right? So over time, now what do? Now first thing I do is I go to YouTube and I look at it,
Hmm.
and it's that success mentality. And once they see it once, it works. On the flip side of that, if you try to do something and it's a complete failure, that's like that old adage of, it takes, seven other times in order to really fix that, right? So you
Hmm.
can't go out there. You need to make sure that you do it right the first time. And if you're going to fix something, if you're going to fail at it quickly, and don't let it proliferate throughout the field, and make sure that you fix it, pretty quickly, right? So
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, so the other thing I wanted to ask you, we kind of touched on this a bit. As you and some of the other new leaders, came into the organization and started digging into, okay, what do we need to do uh, to take DN in the direction it needs to go? Um, did you have any instances where you did have, significant pushback? And if so, how did you handle that?
yeah, I mean, just to kind of follow back on my previous statement, right? It's those typically it's people who have been here a long time, and again, if it fails once for them, it's it's another one of those programs, right? So they're trying to implement the MAIC, or they're trying to implement whatever the scenario is, but consistency really is the important piece, right? So it's not like we do it once and we fail, we back off and we don't do it again. No, this is a continuous. We're going to continue to go march down this road and make sure that
Hmm.
everyone understands that we're putting money down and we're making investments to make sure that we're actually implementing these changes. And when we say we're going to do it, we do it, right? And that's the difference, I think.
Yeah.
When you show people, hey, it's not just we're telling you about it. We're not giving you lip service that we're going to do it. If you tell us it's a problem, we're going to show you that we're going to fix
Hmm.
it. And even if it costs us money, we're going to spend the money, we're going to fix it, and we're going to make it right. So I think
Yeah.
it's those successes that help really mitigate some of that pushback.
Yeah. And I think that's another unrealistic expectation leaders have, especially leaders who, I think, like yourself, have, a good strategic direction and have a good concept of what it's going to take and care, right?
Yep.
Still sometimes, you mistake your intent. You assume that people are going to understand that your intent is good. And so then you say, no, this is different, right?
Yep.
And you expect that resistance to just fade away. Like you expect trust that you haven't yet earned, right?
Exactly.
And
Yep.
the only way to do that, the only real way to do that is show it in action, is
Yep.
to show that you are committed to doing it right. You are committed to listening and solving problems that they care about, and it just takes time, right? And so I think, that's where the disconnect can be, is that if a leader knows that their intent is good, they expect that trust to just exist, without understanding that maybe these people have been through this before with people that didn't care as much or weren't
Yep.
committed to, really understanding. And, we just have to give it time. To your point, stay consistent, stay on it, stay positive, and prove it out, and
Yep.
let them see it work, and they'll come around. That's
Yep.
that resistance, though, it can be frustrating and it can cause friction. And
Hmm.
so we want it to just go away as quickly as
Yeah.
possible. But sometimes we just have to wait it out a little bit.
Yep. Yep. And
Yeah.
show it, right? I mean, again,
Yeah.
some of it comes down to, are they really willing to spend the money on it, right? Are they really
Hmm.
willing to make that change because it's going to cost them money? And I
Yeah.
think, in most instances here at the end, we've been able to do that, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's good.
Yeah. So, tied in with the application of lean in service, part of what DN is looking at holistically is how to continually improve the customer experience.
Yep.
There's a couple things we talked about that I think it would be good to share, which is the first is that you've had an evolution from customer delivery manager to customer success manager. Can you talk a little bit about that shift and what it
Sure.
represents?
Sure. Yeah. So I would start with, we have an organization, or had an organization here in service and in the different regions, basically called customer delivery managers, right? And we literally went back and renamed them officially to customer success managers. And that seems small, but it's a critical difference. So it's not about telling customers, here's how we did last month, here's what we delivered, here's how good we are, here's what we're going to fix, and so forth. It's really shifting that focus to, how are we going to make the customer successful? And that
Hmm.
means, are our KPIs truly what's impacting you and your customers? Are we truly aligned, and having that intelligent discussion with them to make sure that, what we're measuring internally impacts them? And I think that's super important. And when you think about that, it's really taking their data, along with the data which we have a ton of, right, and saying, what's going to happen next week, what's going to happen next month. We
Hmm.
kind of know from a past history of what happens in July. We know what happens in August. How are we preparing for that? Sharing that story with them. Also, when their business is changing, right? You look at ATMs, right? And a lot of people, as you see, kind of this, what I'll call tapping, right? Near field
Hmm.
communications, or RFID. Um, is becoming more prevalent in the banking industry. What does that mean to the customer? Are all
Hmm.
of their devices enabled with that kind of a technology? If not, how do we help fix that? So those kinds of things, being able to look ahead to that and kind of look at that data holistically, both our data and the customer's data, and really be proactive about how we're helping our customers, as opposed to just sitting back and saying, hey, our uptime was X, right? Or
Hmm.
our response time was Y, right? It's like, those are nice metrics, but at the end of the day, they don't really matter that much to customers, especially in an ATM customer. What do people care about? I go to an ATM and I either want to deposit cash or I want to get cash out, right?
Hmm.
That's what matters, not how
Right.
much uptime we had last month, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, it's kind of that shift to thinking about outcomes,
yeah,
and working with customers to make sure you're aligned to, not just we've achieved what we said we will achieve, but we're helping you achieve what you need to achieve.
exactly.
That makes sense. Now, you talked about data, and, you mentioned you have a lot of it. So, I just had someone on recently talking about IoT and how,
Mhm.
with the era of AI that we're in, it makes, all of this data so much more valuable because there's so much, we can do with it. So where are you at from a predictive standpoint today, and where do you see that going?
Yeah. So I will tell you from my experience, and again, doing this for quite a long time, I coming to DN and seeing what we have here at DN, I think we're years ahead of other people in the industry and across industries, to be fair. With what I mentioned before, our All Connect data engine really is kind of the foundation of what we do. And really what that's doing is monitoring those machines that are connected on an ongoing basis. It sends us what we call a flight record every single night. And we basically analyze that. It gives us incredible insights into what's happening on the machine. So we understand before the technician goes there, what's wrong with the machine. So with that, I will say we're currently still focused on a break fix mentality. And then when we get there, we address the other issues that are pointed out by the data predictably, right? But I really truly envision a future where we can intelligently dispatch some technicians proactively if a failure is imminent. So
Hmm.
with that, I want to caution a little bit because you don't want to send a technician just because it might fail, right? You want to make sure that this is a failure truly that's going to take the machine down, right?
Hmm.
And so you have to be very selective on how we do that and make sure that it makes sense from a business perspective, but also from the customer perspective, right?
Hmm.
Maybe for example on an ATM, the printer might is in possibility of going down the next couple of days. Now, is that one that you want to send somebody out to immediately? I'm not sure. Most people don't take a receipt out of an ATM these days, right? They just get it on their phone or whatever. So you have to be intelligent about how you do that.
Hmm.
And I would say then, taking another step forward and saying, once you know that, and then coupling that data with actually dispatching, you can be very selective on which technician you're sending, and based on proximity, part availability, their training. But in addition to that, how successful are they in actually fixing that specific problem? And that's a difference, right? That's a difference than what people are not really necessarily thinking about today. Is this technician, Joe or Sue or whatever their name is, are they really good at fixing this particular problem? And I think
Hmm.
that's the next step.
Yeah. Yeah. Ton of potential, which is really exciting. What aspect of this journey DN is on are you most excited about?
Yeah. So, kind of circling back to the beginning, the willingness to change at the end is really astonishing to me. Coming
Hmm.
from older companies and companies that have been in business for a long time, especially with DN having a lot of legacy. Um, to me, there's really nothing stopping us from becoming the best in service, and I don't mean that just in terms of ATM service or retail space. I mean across industries.
Hmm.
There's really nothing that will stop us from being, truly revolutionary in how we approach service and be somebody who the Harvard Business Review writes cases about in the future.
Hmm.
So that's where I want to be in the future, and I'm excited to be on that journey with Deanne.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, it's hopefully a source of inspiration for folks because so much of what is holding companies back is self-inflicted, and so, it is exciting to come together in a group of people that is committed to doing what it takes, to create that success. But it's more attainable than people think, and so that to me is exciting because I want more people to catch on to that reality. Hey, we don't have to hold to the way it's always been done. We don't
Yep.
have to bog ourselves down with this, and that. We could really do what DN is doing. There's no reason we can't, so I love that. Um, what aspect of this have you found most challenging?
So for me, communication is always the most challenging, right? It's an organization with multi-level management and really trying to, as you said before, trying to get that strategic message and the reason for the change all the way down through the organization. It's just hard to do, right?
Hmm.
And really that's the core of it, is to make sure that people understand why you're doing something, because if they don't understand why you're doing something, they'll make up a reason, right?
Hmm.
And that reason, and we talked about before, if it's a reason that was, somebody just it popped into their head and it's at the, field technician level, it permeates the organization in 15 seconds, right? It's
Hmm.
like, well, they did that just because they hate us, right? It's like, well,
Hmm.
that's not necessarily true, right? And if you talk to the folks, they understand after you explain to them what change you made and why you're making that change. Um, it really, the light bulb goes off, and that's where the rubber hits the road, right?
Yeah.
I need to be out there more in the field. My management team needs to be out there more in the field, and we need to be talking to folks and allowing them to ask questions. Hey, why did you do this? And really give them the straight answer and be totally transparent of. And everyone uses that term, but it's overused. But really tell them, this was our thought process and why we made this change. And
Hmm.
nothing beats that face-to-face communication, as we said. And it's a lot of work, and
Yep.
it's a lot of hours, and it's a lot of visiting a lot of different countries, but it's work and the value, it really is measurable.
Yeah. Absolutely. And there's no shortcut or
Yep.
substitute for that. It really it makes a tremendous difference in how these efforts unfold.
Yep.
and so
Absolutely.
kudos to you for taking it on and doing the hard work. And I think it's a really exciting journey that Deanne is on, and would love to have you back at some point to talk about how it's going, being the best in service, and what more you've learned, and all of that good stuff. I'm no Harvard Business Review, but would love to have you back
Yeah.
nonetheless. So,
My
um,
pleasure.
all right. Well, thank you, Brian. I appreciate you coming and sharing with us.
Thank you.
You can learn more by visiting the home of the Unscripted podcast at futureoffieldservice.com. The podcast is published in partnership with IFS. You can learn more at ifs.com. As always, thank you for listening.